Welcome back to the channel. I wanted to talk to you about a really interesting sort of concept that I've been thinking about recently. It's this idea of influence and influencers. So I think it's really important that we give ourselves time to create our own thoughts, to come up with our own concepts, our own theories. And that means that we can't be constantly consuming other people. So we can't constantly consume social media or consume books or podcasts or learning from other people, because when we do that, it is going to have their influence in it, their outlook on the world, their take on things, the way that they perceive things. And while it's good to use this to broaden our perspective, it's not good to pick one person and just solely listen to what they say. So I was having a conversation with a client the other day, and she was saying, she picks a podcast and kind of goes all in on that podcast for a period of time. And then once she's sort of binged that whole podcast series, then she'll move on to another podcast. And I said to her that the concern with something like that is that for the whole time that you're wrapped in that one podcast, that is the only voice of influence that you hear. So it starts to shift your perception of the world around you based on that person's world. And actually what you start to do, and you might have felt this before, is you start to almost lose a piece of who you are along the way, and you kind of morph into what that person's saying. And then when you move into the next podcast, you kind of morph into what that person's saying. And I hear this really frequently where people will say like, oh yeah, I'm reading this great book and I'm doing all of the activities and I'm kind of following through on all of these things. And then as soon as they move on to the next book, they stop all of the things from the first book and they start doing the things from the second. Never actually building their own personal routine, their own personal way of being that suits them. So I want to ask you today, are you letting one person influence you too much? Are you only listening to one voice in the world? And if that's me, I'm telling you right now, go and find other people to listen to. If you are listening to somebody's podcast or reading, somebody's books back to back, you just need to really ask yourself that question of, are you being too influenced into a particular way of thinking? Now, don't get me wrong, there is good influence, absolutely, but any influence where you lose a part of yourself, I don't think that is necessarily great. So something that I like to do is I will say, for instance, read a certain book, but I will listen to a podcast that's completely different, or I will listen to music that is completely different, or I will, get into a mastermind that's completely different. And I try and move around the people that I'm being influenced by. I always work with 2 coaches at a time, at a minimum, and that way I can make sure that I'm not just overhearing one person's way of doing it. Because realistically, we all have a unique way of looking at the world, of making money in the world, of being happy in the world. So getting completely sucked into one other person's way of doing things can be really detrimental to the journey of kind of looking at who you are in yourself. So I just want you to think about that today. Who are your influences? There is a great saying in the world that you will have heard, which says that we are the amalgamation of the 5 people we spend the most time with. And I want you to think about that in the same sense of you're the amalgamation of the 5 medias you spend the most time with. And that could be really scary, okay? But really think about this. What are you watching? What are you reading? What are you consuming? What social media channels are you following? I have a rule of thumb that on my social media, I only follow like positive news channels, so like the Good News Movement on Instagram, and I make sure that every day I'm seeing their stories on my Instagram rather than like the typical news, because actually that is what I want to fill my life with. And this is what I want you to think about, is like, what are the general things that are coming into your life every single day through media, social media, TV, books, audios, podcasts, music, What are you telling yourself the world is like through those sources? And then the same for the 5 people you spend the most time with. What are they telling you the world is like? You know, are they in abundance? Are they in struggle? Do they believe that the world is a good place? Do they not? Like, what does that look like? And just really sit down with yourself and ask yourself, are you creating more than you're consuming? Are you thinking more than you're reading? Are you writing more than you're watching? Genuinely ask yourself those questions, because I promise you life gets so much better once you shift that balance and make yourself the creator rather than just consuming everyone else. Okay, I'm gonna love and leave you on that note, but make sure that you subscribe to the channel. There are loads of people that watch these videos that are not subscribed to the channel, and it would mean the absolute world to me if you could just hit the subscribe button and the like button so that I know that you're here and you're watching. I will see you soon.